information will be at the end. So welcome everybody again to the Wednesday webinar on use commanding strategies to dominate the competition. Many of us hear phrases such as competitive advantage. We're going to go past that today, and that's really what commanding strategy is all about, going beyond the concept of just a commanding strategy to a sustainable one for a period of time. So I'm going to focus on a few things. I'm a teacher, as many of you know. I teach here at CUNY in New York City, and I also teach at USST, University of Shanghai. And so I kind of always want to make sure everyone's on the same wavelength, so I try to explain terms. So we'll focus a little bit on terminology to get started, and we're going to focus on the fact that purpose isn't strategy, and we'll come to that at a second point later on, as you'll see. We're going to focus on how a good strategy and a commanding strategy eventually comes from the fact that it's a systematic means to an end, and then if it's done in a way that gives you an asymmetric, sustainable, competitive advantage, it's a commanding strategy. So that's our definition: asymmetric, sustainable, competitive advantage. And we're actually going to introduce some brand new work by people like Peter Thiel, who does SpaceX and Singularity University, to give you an understanding of how they're moving in the same direction we are. And then we'll leave you with some next steps so that you can actually take this and apply it to your work. So let's just define a couple of terms. The purpose of your company isn't really the strategy. Strategy is part of it. So what you do when you're starting a company and you have a look at it, you want to think about what impact you're going to have on the world. I have a colleague who says, try to look at the headline that you're going to read in a newspaper, or if there's no newspaper anymore, on your online digital news feeder, and what's it going to say about you. So if you were a company like Microsoft in the 1970s, building it and looking at the vision, their goal was to be able to create the kind of software that would allow anybody to take this thing called a desktop computer, put it on every desk, so that every desk has a computer. That was their vision, and that's what guided everything that they've done to make that easy to work with. That's different than the mission. It's not a headline. The mission is something very personal to everybody in the company and to the leadership. It's why everybody gets up in the morning to work for the company. So, for example, if I'm Starbucks, everybody in Starbucks knows that the mission is to get up in the morning and make sure that when people come into a Starbucks retail outlet, they have a great coffee experience. That's why their invention when they started was to think of it as a third place. So people go there, have their coffee, stay there, do some thinking, do some talking, whatever the case may be, and as we know, it expanded way beyond it. So the mission's personal to all the employees. It's why they get up every morning to do the work they do. Within that mission, each person and the company is going to have a set of goals. So the goal might be, as overall, is to increase sales by 27%. The question you need to look at if you're going to do something like that is, how do you do that? And that breaks down to specific objectives. So the company as a whole, and again, each individual might look at it. So that 27%, where does that come from? It comes from the fact that new customers, the number of new customers might be increasing by 10% and buying an average amount that you had before. Then you want all of them to increase their size of orders by 7%. You want to increase business by another 10%. In the net result, you put it all together. The causes of increased sales might have added to 27%. Obviously, new customers buying larger amounts becomes multiplicative, and that would even give you greater boost. So each objective is a very specific thing you do. If you're in sales, the goal might be to hit quota, but that's broken down into a number of customers, number of buyers, number of repeat buyers, net margins, whatever kinds of things you're looking at. And then when you've focused on all of these issues in terms of the purpose of the company, and then you have to build a strategy now to make it happen, the one thing you need to recognize is the strategy is a thought process that can only work if the culture supports it. And so you want to look at the values that the company has. Is there teamwork as a value? Does it, in Starbucks' case, one of the critical issues that every full-time employee have good health care. That became a value. So the values are how people treat each other, how they treat themselves, how they treat their customers, how they treat their environment. The values giving back, for example, to the community are all values. So with a purpose And values, you can then build strategy. And with strategy, it's a real simple definition that we like to use. It's a plan of action designed to achieve a set of goals, and then each one's a specific goal. So it's really a process of doing that through understanding what are the resources you have, what are your capabilities to do things, and then mobilizing your resources and capabilities to achieve the corporate purpose. If you think about that, then that gives you an interesting approach. The approach is to look outside the company and inside. So the external analysis is where it always starts. What are our opportunities? So, for example, if you're in the business of offering airline services, and the services are having a problem right now because people want to get faster service. They don't want to sit and wait as long. They want to be able to have a comfortable experience and not be feeling like they're sardines in a can. Then looking at that competitive environment tells you where you should go, what you should do. So a company like JetBlue decides to be low cost but focus high end. Southwest focuses on point to point to save people lots of money, but it's not necessarily focusing on doing a higher end. Walmart looks at the environment and focuses on people's need to save money. Nordstrom might be focusing on quality service. How do you make those decisions what to focus on? That goes to internal analysis. What are the resources you have? What are the capabilities you have? What is it you're best at doing? So, for example, one of the things that Presentation Excellence Group has as an advantage that we do in our services is we initially started helping companies present more effectively, especially executives, especially those involved with financial transactions such as IPOs, mergers, acquisitions, raising money, etc. And inevitably, as our clients learned, we could not just help them present their information better, but we actually made great improvements in the quality of the presentation in terms of the content, the style, the format, and that led us to expand from just presentation training and coaching to the Presentation Excellence Group, which provides a variety of other leadership services. Again, our internal analysis told us we could do more and we could help them. Knowing that, you still have to ask yourself the question, how do I differentiate myself from my competition so people will understand who I am? That's easy to see if you take a look at 1962. Why 1962, you ask? Well, that's within a 6-month period of time in that year, Walmart, Kmart, and Target all started. They all had understood the external analysis that people were moving out into the suburbs, that they were going to do shopping. They didn't want to go from store to store to store to store, but rather they would rather go to a centralized place where they could pick up a lot of things. And because they could put them in the car, if they could figure out a way to offer them good services at a reasonable price, they could get their business. The interesting part is they chose different strategies. Walmart focused on figuring out a way, it's called the opportunity loop, to provide everyday low prices. Target, on the other hand, said, you know something, we can't really do that kind of great operations. We have a different set of expertise. We love fashion. Let's offer branding. And so they created a higher end brand, more expensive than Walmart, but still cheaper than you would get elsewhere. And that became the claim to fame and the branding proposition of Target. Kmart struggled. It grew very quickly, as did the other two. But in the 1990s, it got stuck in between. It wanted to have some branding, but it also wanted to have the everyday low cost of Walmart. And it didn't have the corporate structure. Hence, at the end of the 90s, it goes bankrupt. And its future is a function of those kinds of problems. So you need to look at it and really understand where it's coming from. The next part is implementation. It's a great thing to have a strategy, but it only makes sense if you figured out how to execute on it, if you've built the implementation systems that make a difference. And that's what you want to focus in on. And finally, if you're going to make a commitment to strategy, don't think that you're going to add evaluation at the end. What you want to do is add it at the beginning by embedding evaluation systems into everything you're doing. That's the critical part. And that we spoke about that last week when we talked about Evaluate to Win as a technology. So going into some depth, what are the external things you look at? What's the state of technology? What's economics? Think about it today, the world. how that's affecting travel, how it's affecting the dollar exchange, all of these things happening. We talk about millennials all the time. It's a world that's changing from having everybody centralized in an office to a virtual workforce that's working on multiple contents, flex time. The entire world is changing in terms of many of the things. And if you want to succeed with your workforce and succeed with profit margins, you need to take that into account. For those of you not familiar, Michael Porter at Harvard came up with many years ago the five forces that shape the competition. And here are the critical things. You look at your rivals. You look at the bargaining power that buyers have, because if they have a lot of it, then you don't have a lot of leeway. You look at the bargaining power of your suppliers. If there are many you can then work with, they can work with you. If there's only one or two, you have more power over them. You need to deal with the fact that there's always a threat of a new entrant, and there's also a new threat of a substitute product or service. So if you take a good look, for example, at Southwest Airlines was essentially designed as a method of beating out not airlines, but actually Greyhound buses from one city in Texas to another, Austin to Dallas. And so what they did is they came up with a way to offer faster service at less money even than the bus, and that became for Greyhound a threat of a substitute product or service that eventually generated a new airline in the whole country. Again, you look at your internal capabilities, as I said, and that's very often using something called a SWOT: strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And this takes a lot of work to figure out what really are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and whether you want to overcome them or you just want to marginalize them and get around them. What are the opportunities for your industry and for you maybe individually and particularly, and what threats do you need to deal with? So today, if you're producing, as many companies, we're going through an earnings season right now, many companies are reporting that their sales in terms of volumes are up, but their revenues are actually down because of 10% difference in the dollar. Exchange rates is affecting them. And then once you've done that, as I said, what you have to do is differentiate yourself. What makes your company different than everybody? So Walmart is a low-cost provider. Apple is not. It's focusing on differentiating its product. It's, in fact, their product in a whole league by itself. Or what you might decide to do is focus just on a niche, some small part of the segment that no one's looking at. So, for example, if I'm selling an electric car like Tesla, I'm a product differentiator. If I'm selling a Maserati, where the amount of money that it costs to buy one is so high, it's going to be a very small niche. And so different companies will work in different places, and you have to decide where do you want to focus. The key is you want to harness your capabilities internally, your ability to build a strategy to overcome your competition, and put it all together. And once you've done that, you have to figure out, what do I need to implement it? Well, the most important thing is you need people and systems and policies. And so what you want to do is recruit the right people, the A team. You want to develop a system for training them to stay always at the A team and promote them accordingly. You have to resolve, how do you do that? What's your organizational model? What systems and policies do you have? I work with many companies. As you may know, I work with Vistage, which is 19,000 CEOs who run companies between $5 million and $1 billion. And very often what we discover is that the systems and policies are actually conflicting and contradict certain parts, and that's what creates stress for people. And what's your organizational model? There are different kinds of charts and systems to use. Is it functional? Is it small business? Are you focusing on the business or geography? All kinds of things. Today, many companies are matrix managed systems, which is what was used to create NASA and put a man on the moon. But for other people, it's something even different. The new network model that we discuss, I teach about. At that point, if you've got all the model, you ask yourself each time, how do I make sure that the moving parts work as well as they're supposed to? And you do that by building KPIs who measure what you're doing, both financial and customer focused. And what you do is incorporate them in the system. So, for example, when I work with my clients, I always say, I'm not that interested initially in just having good numbers. I want to know why those numbers are good. Are we getting more people coming back and using our services, more repeat business, less churning, more referrals? It's the behaviors that I'm trying to get from my customers that determines my success and where I'm trying to go. One of the ways of conceptualizing that, which is something I work with very often with my CEOs and with my students, is the concept of an open systems model. The whole world can be put together in terms of a system as the inputs, which are your capabilities and your resources that you have available. The throughputs, that means what it is you're doing, the process by which you're providing the service or product that you're trying to create. And then the outputs, which really divide into two parts: the immediate outcome that you have, what is it you produce. So if you sell coffee, it's a bottle, it's a vented coffee that someone can take home and go to their office with. And it's the longer term impact. I really love this coffee. It's great. I'm going to go back there again. If you're a university, you've got a variety of inputs: students, finances, location, teaching techniques. Are the processes? What are the different ways? Are you using PowerPoint? Are you using Blackboards? Are you doing lectures? What's the process used to educate people? The outputs are usually both a combination of the immediate one, which is graduates, as I tell my students, if they get through the course, they graduate. But then what they're really looking for is good jobs. And so that's the long-term one. If they've got great jobs and they can thank their school for making this possible, the feedback usually is that they become generous alumni. And so that would be affecting the input again. So what's a commanding strategy? Okay, because all of this is about strategies. The key is this. In a strategy, you want to have something that you can use long-term. It needs to be sustainable. But many times when a company comes up with something, think of McDonald's and Burger King, and somebody says, I changed our strategy, we're going to offer $1 menu. It's not a sustainable model, because what will happen is the other company can just copy it. And then what happens is, unfortunately, it actually produces a downward spiral. The point is, what you need is something that stays in existence longer. And the only way it stays in existence longer, becomes a really sustainable one, is by figuring out what it is they can't do. And the best way to do that is to use what we call an asymmetric sustainable competitive advantage, or what we've called a commanding strategy, which means your strength is built on something that your other competitors think are strengths, but are actually for them weaknesses relative to you, and you can do it. So, for example, if you think of the classic story of David and Goliath, Goliath is giant and it's big, and if David would have tried to fight him in his own league, he never stood a chance. The only way he did it was to say, well, if this guy's very big and he doesn't think he needs to protect his head, then that becomes asymmetric, in that he's not protecting the part that I can reach easily by throwing a rock at him, and that gave him a sustainable advantage to make the difference. What's hard for most people to understand is, inevitably, to make those decisions, you need to make trade-offs. And so I thought I would give you some simple examples from some of these companies that have done this, that have successfully done what they've done. One that I think is a really good advantage, a way for us to understand it, is TD Bank. As you may know, they advertise themselves to be America's most convenient bank. They're also one of the fastest growing banks as a result. Why? They're open 7 days a week for retail operations, something like 12 hours a day, even especially on weekdays, and on weekends generally 5-6 hours. And the question becomes, how do they do this? Because think about it. If you're, let's say, Citibank, Chase Bank, any other bank, Capital One, you could imitate the same thing. You could offer more retail services hours. But the reason that they don't, and we know that because TD Bank's been doing this now for several years, and the rest are not really changing their schedule, is because there's an economic model difference. The people at Citibank and Chase offer a large variety of services. So you need to hire people who are capable of presenting them very effectively. Whereas TD Bank has a limited number of services that it's offering, so that it doesn't have to hire as many people. If it doesn't hire as many higher cost people, it can then stagger its people through the weekends where it doesn't need those people, and that gives it its advantage. So their trade-off is they're going to give you convenience, but they're giving you lower interest rates, and what they're doing is fewer extra services. And for those people who don't care that much about interest rates or the extra services, that convenience is the difference. Let's take Walmart. It doesn't focus on stores in terms of strategy like Kmart did. What it did is it took a different look. It leveraged the fact that many stores are around one area, the warehouse, and became a network. So its logistics were not built around stores, but around distribution centers. decided that its effectiveness in getting prices down, what's called the opportunity loop, lower prices, which produce higher volumes, which becomes cyclical, meant they needed to keep pressure on suppliers to keep costs low, and that they passed those savings on to customers to encourage even more buying. And in doing that, they actually set the standards for low-cost discounting. But what's important to understand is that this involved a trade-off. The trade-off was lower prices is something we can consistently do. We know that we're going to keep pressure on our suppliers, but the customers are going to reap that benefit. But they will not reap the benefit of high-quality customer service, which I would get if I were going to a higher-priced retailer like a Nordstrom. So again, everyday low price trade-off is within comparing them to companies that provide everyday high-quality service. Zappos is the opposite. It recognized that there's a problem. People don't want to buy something they can't find out if it's going to work for them, so they can't buy shoes online if you can't try them on, and so that would limit the amount of shoe purchasing. So Zappos decided to come up with a whole new concept of offering the ability for you to get free shipping both ways and not worry about it. So a person could order 27 pairs of shoes, find once one or two, and have the other 25 or 26 returned. The second thing it does in doing that is it tries then to create a culture for people who say, I'm not sure what I want, I'm willing to do this, and then experience what this great customer service is all about. So if you listen to Zappos, you hear their storytelling, their culture, which is stories of excellence about incredible services that they offer people and facility tours. In fact, one of their cultural stories is about the fact that they provide training, and today it's, I think, $3,000. They provide training for 2 weeks, and if you will, at the end, they offer you cash, $3,000 to leave. If this isn't really right for you, take the money and leave, and you're ahead of the game. Or you give up the cash, but then you're really committed to staying. And the net result is it gets really committed workers. So it provides awesome services, but it isn't the lowest cost provider. You can find cheaper shoes elsewhere. Dell, when it first started, did the same thing. It figured out how to become a smart assembly provider and therefore low cost. So it told customers what you can do is you can order directly on the internet rather than buying through a store, and this would allow them to be able to provide you with a good product. But what was critical here was how they could keep their costs lower, because remember, customers paid for the PC before it was even built. So it provided a cash flow advantage. Again, a competitive advantage that from that point of view couldn't be met. Whereas other people, let's say in those days, Compaq and IBM, who were selling retail, were selling through third-party wholesalers, and that put them at a cost advantage because they had to build it, sell it to the intermediary, who then would pass it on to the stores and to the customers. And so there was a 30, 60, 90-day process before they got paid, and obviously that meant they had to have more money. And so change would threaten their business models. Apple's a great example that ecosystem platforms beat system integration. It's created a commanding user experience designing holistic ecosystem solutions, iMacs, iTunes, iPhones, iPads, etc., rather than just saying we're going to integrate different pieces from different vendors, etc. So the old world of system integration is what they're actually opposed to, and the net result is the sum of the parts is bigger than each of the individual parts. And how do we know that? Because they charge a premium for it, and it's led to very high standards for consumers, for technology, for entertainment industry, telephony, etc. So the trade-off they made is a unique product line and culture versus being part of the traditional PC distribution channels, and that's why they almost went bankrupt in the late 1990s, because it wasn't working well, and they had the idea, but they hadn't put it all together. And then when Steve Jobs came back, he did and created a new thing, iMacs, iTunes, iPhones, etc. Starbucks, again, an example. It decided, there were billions, literally millions of coffee shops around the cities that you could go into. Why would you go to pay more money with a unique language when you're ordering it? You couldn't order small, medium, large. It had to be, venti if you want something large. You had to use that language because they were creating a new culture. And so their whole idea was this is the third place. So we're going to give you a place where you can relax besides home and office and enjoy your coffee. And the process wasn't that you're drinking something, but actually you're having an affordable indulgence, something you would do and enjoy in your place and your time with other people, and that people would pay a little extra money for. So higher costs, which they had to provide the space to get better beans, etc., meant higher prices, but competitors couldn't match the brand value and therefore the loyalty that this commanding strategy had, which is why they've grown so much faster than Dunkin' Donuts with its coffee, or McDonald's with its. Enterprise, again, is an example of taking on a different approach. What it did is, when all the car companies, Hertz, Avis, National, Budget, were focusing on how do we help business or vacation people use cars, they asked a different question, and that was, if I have a car and I've had an accident and it's in the body shop, where do I get another car? And so their goal was not to have vacation cars, but temp cars, and recognize that it needed to do something special. It needed to help the people get there because clearly they don't have their cars. And so they went after picking up service. And this pickup service for cars uniquely differentiated them from all of their other competitors who were saying, come to our airport. And at our airport, there's a counter for Hertz or Davis or whatever the case may be. And so there was a contrast. Within very little time, Enterprise actually became bigger than the other companies and then decided to use its formula to be able to go after those vacation travelers as well. And that's been the key part. The other parts, they organize their stores differently. There's a real marketing opportunity for the employee to realize that if you get involved and you get engaged, you can grow, and you can grow in the company and become a leader in the company. And that excitement for the employees has led to them becoming a real leader in this industry by a great deal right now. Zipcar similarly started with a very interesting concept of crowd sharing, in that people would share cars, especially urban young people in the urban dwellers who didn't have a place for cars, didn't have a need for cars, didn't want to pay for them, didn't need it for the whole day when they were renting. They needed it only for a couple of hours. So they focused on using technology. They leveraged technology to be able to allow people to do it. And these small cars were more suited for them, so they didn't go for fancy cars. They were going for smaller cars and making special deals with manufacturers, which made them work. The interesting part, again, is they had a commanding strategy. Avis eventually bought them out. Hertz tried to compete by creating its own thing, but the culture wasn't as good, and the result is it's still a work in progress. At this point, Zipcar maintains its lead as a part of Avis, if you're curious. Enterprise offers one too, and they're losing money in their business. So again, developing it in a way that creates a commanding strategy is key to profitability. As I mentioned, I teach, and I always I always tease my students with a company we've made up called Baruch Burgers, and the concept is, how do we develop a successful new burger joint near Baruch that's going to compete with all those big chain stores? Because if you walk down 23rd Street, you can see every one out there. And the answer is by offering what they don't offer. So offering only healthy vegetarian foods, charge accounts that are linked to the student IDs, offering services during the break between classes were three things that, for example, students could theoretically get that would give them an advantage, and there's no way McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's is ever going to try to meet them. And so the result is they theoretically would have a commanding strategy, and at least from a Baruch point of view, if the food's that good, would be able to have a commanding strategy. And as my students recently pointed out, if it is, then we can do this nationwide and call it University Burgers and rename them each for their school. And the final part that I want to bring to your attention is something really new and exciting. It's called exponential organizations. In many ways, that's really where some of the new commanding strategies are visible. Look at Airbnb. Look at Uber. Look at Waze. These are examples of what Ismail calls exponential organizations. What's an exponential organization? It's an organization that uses an organizing technique that leverages accelerating technologies and non-owned assets to have a disproportionately large impact, very often referred to as the 10x equation. To take Airbnb, which today is actually market capped in terms of its value, it's not yet a public company, at more than many of the hotel chains that are out there. Remember, they don't own any hotel. They don't own any real estate, any rooms. Okay? So it's non-owned assets. Their technology is obviously the ability for someone to use smartphones and computers to be able to communicate what they're trying to do and organize people, in this case, people who are renting and leasing out the space for that night or whatever the case may be. Uber does a similar thing. It doesn't own any cars. It doesn't own the drivers. It says to people, if you want to drive a car, we'll hook you up so that you can get the business. And again, they're now assessed, both of those companies, in the tens of billions of dollars. Waze is another example of a company that's an exponential company. Actually, the story on this, I just finished reading it because it was just so interesting. So I'll give you some of the facts and figures on this one. Many years ago, Nokia wanted to get into the GPS business and offer people a GPS service that would allow them to use their phones to figure out where they are and what they're doing, especially for traffic and for mapping. And so they bought a company called NetValve. And what they did in this situation is they spent $8 billion to buy a company that had sensors in the road that would allow them to know where their traffic is, so they could use that information to be able to help people figure out where and to go and how to map themselves and use their strategy for doing it. A few years later, a company by the name of Waze was created, and they said, you know what, we don't need to put sensors in the road and own them. What we can do instead is just get people who have smartphones, which automatically have this capability of sensing what's going around and reporting on it, to be able to give us some of this information. And within 2 years, created a similar system. Within 4 years, actually had 10 times more GPS-related information for mapping and everything. And actually stole the market because Google bought them for $1.1 billion and is now the process being used by so many different smartphones that are out there. So it's an example of it. What's critical here is to understand in every company you need, as Simon Sinek calls it, a why. Why are you doing it? But it's not just a why from a factual point of view, but from an aspirational point of view. So I aspire to find a place where I can live relatively inexpensively and maybe give me a feeling for the culture, so living in other people's homes are fine. I aspire to have a cab here when I want it that's convenient and takes me and makes me feel good. Uber. All of these kinds of companies do it. It's a phenomenal book. I highly recommend you read it, Exponential Organization, to learn so much more about it. But what's important to understand, each of them is using what we call a commanding strategy. So what's the next step? You've made a decision that you want to dominate the competition. That's when you need to get a commanding strategy. So that's it. You have to decide. If you don't care, if you just want to compete, if you just want to do 1 or 2% increase every year, you don't want to dominate the competition. You don't need necessarily a commanding strategy. But if you do, it starts with you as a leader. And leaders have to then identify, what is the purpose of our company? What is our why? How do we want to serve people? And what's the services we want to offer them? So think about it. When you take cab services, how many people rate the cab drivers? Okay, unless they're really terrible, probably nobody says anything. They're really great, I'm not sure too many people say anything. Yet the encouragement of Uber and Lyft is to evaluate people all the time. Again, it's a different purpose because they're trying to get people who are going to feel good about every part of it. You then have to communicate this to everybody. In this case, it's marketing, advertising, it's all viral, to inspire, empower, and mobilize the team. In a case like Uber or Airbnb, it's both the people who provide the service and the people who use the service. So these leaders have to be very smart in terms of how they're doing it. They have to focus on understanding their qualities in addition to traditional leadership, is they have to have informational IQ, access to all the information that everyone needs at any time. They have to have great communication skills for people and work well with people. Just think about that when you're doing something like Uber, all your different drivers, you need to communicate them and listen. So, perfect example, last night in our class, we talked about it. They've actually expanded their service right now to help new drivers actually buy at a lower price, a discounted price because of special deals, new cars. So, this way they can constantly say, all of our cars are less than 4 years old. And the final thing is what leaders with commanding strategies are doing are they're betting their company. They're betting their company on an ability to provide a high quality service that others haven't necessarily offered. And so they need the courage of their convictions. And you have to do that. So if you feel that's you, now you're ready to go build a commanding strategy. One, analyze your business, both internally and externally, starting with the external. Decide what really makes our business special, what's our unique product that's worth more money if someone's going to buy it, or what are the systems we need to be the low-cost provider, what niche do we want to focus in on? Maybe it's customer service like Nordstrom's and Zappos. Then what are your strategies giving you? Are they giving you what you want, an asymmetric competitive advantage? In other words, are you building on the weakness of your other companies? So like TD Bank, as long as other companies are spending more money per person in their banks, the tellers, etc., because they need to be smarter to handle more services, you're not going to have them sitting around at 7 o'clock in the morning in most banks or at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday. And that gives you, from the point of view of convenience, for TD Bank, an asymmetric competitive advantage. And then you have to implement a system to make sure it works, evaluate it constantly, and use the feedback. If you do that, you're ready. Go dominate the competition. And that's why we invited you here today, because we want you to be able to do that. It'll make your life easier. It'll actually make it more fun, and you'll have more time for yourself. If you have any additional questions, here's my contact information. Please feel free to send an email to me or call me at any time so that we can help you. And don't forget that we have another program next week on negotiations, the week after on rainmaking, and the week after on new gen leadership. We look forward to seeing you then. We wish you a great day.